about the different branches and roles in the U.S. government. So, if we think about the government like a body, the mind is going to be the legislative branch where all the decisions are made. The judicial branch is going to be like the conscience where we decide right and wrong, or in the case of the government, constitutionality and unconstitutionality. And the body is going to be the executive branch, the hands and feet where practical force is and things get done. So the first branch is Congress. And so under the Constitution, Congress has the right to collect tax, pay debt, regulate foreign commerce, establish bankruptcy law, coin money, punish counterfeiting, establish post offices, roads, promote useful sciences and art, punish piracy and felony, declare war, raise an army and navy, legislate D.C., and make laws in order to execute their power. They can also amend the Constitution, define the punishment for treason, and decide where Supreme Court trials should be held when they're not specific to one state. So those are the main powers of Congress that is established in the Constitution. But Congress is split into two houses. So there's the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so in the Senate, there's 2 senators from each state. So each state, regardless of size, has equal representation in the Senate. And so senators serve 6-year terms, and they're led by the vice president. Then the House of Representatives, the number of representatives varies based on population of the state. So this is more, it's typically larger states with higher population obviously are going to have more representatives. So it's more of a population voice, whereas the Senate is more of a state voice, I guess. So yeah, and so House of Representatives is led by their chosen speaker. They're not led by the vice president. Yeah, so in Congress is usually the one that makes the laws, makes the bills, and makes all these decisions like the mind of the body. The second branch is going to be the judicial, and this is made up of lots of different federal courts with the Supreme Court at the top. So members of the Supreme Court serve lifelong terms, as the Constitution puts it, during good behavior. So unless they're impeached or have reason, or I guess retire, usually until they die though, they serve on the Supreme Court. So cases that might come up are cases concerning the Constitution, or U.S. federal law, or U.S. treaties, or ambassadors, or maritime jurisdiction, or any controversies in which the U.S. is a parties, or any conflicts across state boundaries between citizens, between actual states. Anything between 2 different states goes to federal court. And then also any person or state against a foreign nation or citizen or state is going to go to the Supreme Court or federal court. So the executive branch is the president, and made up of the president, the vice president, and his cabinet. So it kind of makes sense. So like I said before, this is usually the branch that gets things done because there's not as many people in it. It's mostly the president, and so he can make a decision and act on it. He doesn't have to convince all of Congress every single time he wants to do something. Well, within his power. We'll get to that later, though. So, President is the commander of the Army and Navy. He also has the power to grant reprieves and pardons. He serves a 4-year term. He can also call and dismiss Congress and fill vacancies in the Senate. He can also make treaties when 2/3 of the Senate approve it. But he's, like I said, he's the hands and feet. He's the one that can get it done because he's one person and he doesn't have to convince everyone every time. So now, so those are the 3 branches. Now we're going to talk a bit about how each branch kind of balances out the other ones, make sure nobody has all the power. So the Congress is usually the one that is going to pass bills. But the system that we have for passing bills makes sure that it's not just Congress. So when there's a bill written, it has to go through the House of Representatives and the Senate and get a majority vote from both. Then it goes to the president and he can sign it, in which case it goes straight to being a law. Or if he vetoes and says, no, this should not be a law, it goes back to Congress. And if both houses still give it a 2/3, then they don't need the president's permission and it goes straight to being law. So this kind of balances out Congress and president's power to where if most of Congress wants something, but not everyone, the president can decide. But if the president doesn't want it, but like 2/3 of Congress does, then it can still become law. So it makes sure that neither one of them has too much power. And then once it becomes a law, if a case comes up concerning it, and the Supreme Court goes and reviews the law, and if they say it's constitutional, then it's fine, it stays a law. But if they say, you know what, I don't think this actually fits within the Constitution at all, then the law can become null and void if they repeal it. So as for judicial power, there's not a ton of these. The president can kind of influence the Supreme Court because he gets to appoint or nominate the justices, and then the Senate has to approve it. And then Congress can also kind of influence the Supreme Court because they can amend the Constitution, which is going to change, because all Supreme Court stuff is basically ruled as constitutional or unconstitutional. And so when Congress changes the Constitution, it changes what's constitutional and what's not. So they can kind of influence how the Supreme Court rules because they're changing the basis on which it judges. And then impeachment is basically how the check on the legislative branch. So when there's a member of the legislative branch that is suspected of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors, then the House of Representatives can call for a trial. And so once a trial is called for, then the Senate becomes the jury. And when it's the president, then the head of the Supreme Court acts as the judge. So this makes sure that if the president is doing something illegal or wrong, that Congress can keep him in check. So now I'm going to run through a couple of hypotheticals, situations where we can see the three branches interact. So first of all, what if the president suddenly declares that he's purchased Australia for $4 trillion, but he hasn't talked to Congress about it at all. He just decides this and makes a public announcement. What should happen? Well, first of all, this shouldn't happen in the first place because the president is not the one that gets to decide what we buy and what we don't buy. It would need to be a bill. And like I talked about before, the path of the bill, it would need to go to Congress and get a majority vote, and then the president could sign it. But it would have to come from Congress first. Another hypothetical. So this one's a little bit complicated. I'll just read it to you. A woman wants to unplug her husband, who has been debilitated by a car accident, from life support, but the doctors and judges in her home state, Nevada, will not allow it. She takes her husband from the hospital in an ambulance and drives him to another state, Oregon, where doctors are happy to unplug him. If he is left in this condition for a few days, he will die from starvation and dehydration. The husband's parents, not wanting this, have him transported back to Nevada, and the parents and the wife sue each other. Because the case is across state boundaries, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules that the man must be unplugged, but the doctors in Nevada refuse to unplug him, and the governor of Nevada refuses to make them unplug him. The Supreme Court orders that the army be sent in to take control of the situation. You're the president of the United States. What do you do? So, we talked about president before and how he's the commander of the Army and Navy. So basically what's happening is Supreme Court made a ruling and nobody's listening to them. So, or like states aren't listening to them. or people. Yeah. So doctors are not listening to the Supreme Court ruling, and they want the Army to enforce it. However, in this example, they say that the Supreme Court ruled that the doctors have to unplug the patient. I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court would not rule that. They might say, oh, it's constitutional for him to be unplugged, but they aren't going to decide he should be unplugged. They might say, oh, the wife has the right to choose, in which case she can take him to Oregon to be unplugged. But I don't think that it's necessarily the Army's or the President's role to enforce what the Supreme Court says should be done in the life of this guy. So, yeah, I'm not exactly convinced that this situation would happen exactly how it's said in the problem. So, next one having to do with impeachment. What if the New York Times and the Washington Post announced that the president sold military plans to a country that is hostile to the U.S. in exchange for a large campaign donation? What should happen? So, I talked about impeachment earlier, and that's basically what would happen. The House of Representatives would need to call for a trial, and I think they probably would. If it was just rumors floating around on social media, like, oh no, the president needs to be impeached, like, they might ignore it. But if it's the Washington Post and the New York Times, those are some pretty big voices, and so a lot of the American public is going to be concerned and suspecting of, treason. So hopefully the House of Representatives would acknowledge that and want to know the truth. So they would call for a trial, and then there would be investigations, and all the evidence would be shown to the Senate, and the Senate would then need 2/3 vote in order to convict him, and the head of the Supreme Court would be the judge. Okay, so those are a couple examples to kind of show you how the different branches interact with each other. I hope that this presentation has shown you a little bit about each branch of the government and how they each check each other's power. Thanks for watching.